Now let's take a look at the has pseudo class selector. This selector allows you to select an element based on whether it has one or more descendants that match a particular selector. This is also known as the family selector. You can not only choose things that are descendants, but you can also choose things that come before others, siblings, preceding siblings, and descendants. This selector has a ton of flexibility. It's finally giving us the ability to select something that precedes another element, which is a feature that web developers have wanted for a long time. It is worth mentioning that the has pseudo class selector is not fully supported. You can see globally it has just about 85% support, and in the US it's about 87%. At present, the main browser that does not support this feature is Firefox. We are hopeful that Firefox should offer support sometime in 2023, so keep your fingers crossed on that one. In the meantime, I'll show you how this feature works, and I'll give you some fallback solutions in case you want to make sure that your website will work correctly across the board. My starting file looks like this. And I'll just introduce you to the HTML. It is worth mentioning that I'm loading Google Fonts, Font Awesome, my own custom style sheet, and the structure of my page is that all of my content is wrapped inside of a main element. I'm dealing with multiple articles that have classes of cards. Some of them contain images and divs with class of card content. Some may have H1s, H2, and paragraphs, but then I have others that don't have that card content div, and perhaps they don't have an H1 or an image, and then I have other items that contain font awesome icons along with some text. So these are not all the same, which is why they look a little bit different when we're viewing them here. In the CSS, I have some CSS variables that are styling the colors. I have a universal selector, I have rule on my body, I have some rules for H1, H2, and paragraphs. I have a rule on main that is using display grid, which is why my cards appear in 3 columns. I have some formatting for my cards themselves, and we previously looked at an exercise where we use the is functional selector. I'm using that. I also have some rules on my article card images where I'm styling them 50%. This is making them half the width that they normally are. In addition, I have some rules on my anchor links. I'm using the font awesome icon of the right pointing chevron just to make my links a little bit more interesting. And finally, I have a general rule for images that make them responsive, and I have a rule for my font awesome icons that are making them large, putting a color on them, and adding a text shadow. Now, as you can see, if you look at my headings, there is spacing between these elements. So all of my elements are being spaced out, and this is based on the rules that we had previously added to our content. Ideally, what I'd like to have happen is when there's an H1 and an H2, I want these to snug up to each other, but when there's only an H1, I want the same amount of spacing that is showing here. We're going to go ahead and add some custom rules so that we can accomplish this, as well as changing the layout on some of the cards, the ones with the images. Let's get started by dealing with the H1s. This H1 is actually displaying in the way that I want it to. This one does not have an H2 and it looks just fine. The cards that have an H1 and an H2 are the ones that are problematic. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add some new rules for these particular items. The selector I'm going to use is going to be article.card:has, and then I'm going to specify in parentheses H2. This is going to be looking for all cards that contain H2s. Then I'm going to use a space and I'm going to write H1. What this is saying is that it's looking for cards that contain H2s, and then we're going to target the H1s. In the case of my cards, the H1s come before the H2s. This is something that's really easy to do using the has selector. What I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to set my padding bottom to 0. To make this easier to see, I'm going to change the color of these H1s to yellow so that they'll stand out. When I refresh my page, you're going to see that all of the cards that contain H2s and have an H1 are going to take on the new styles that we've established. This will allow these to not only appear yellow, but it's also going to get rid of that one rem of padding that we had added previously. I still want there to be a little bit less space between the H1 and the H2, so I will simply go ahead and make a rule for article.card space H2, and all we're going to do here is set the padding on the top to 0. If we save now and we refresh, you'll see how the spacing is going to snug up between the H1s and the H2s. You can see I'm getting an unwanted result in this middle card, and that's the fact that I am reducing the padding here as well. This is something that I don't want to do. So what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and we'll use our has selector. This time we're going to ask for the cards that have H1s, and then we're going to target our H2s. So we're basically doing the same thing, just the opposite. And now if we refresh, you will see that this first card no longer is going to have that padding top of 0. It goes back to its default padding of 1 rem that we had created before. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the layout of our cards. So any card that has an image, I want it to actually span and take up 2 of my 3-column grid. Once again, we're going to use the has selector to accomplish this. I'll make a selector for article.card. We're going to use has, and then we'll pass in image. And since not all of my cards have images, this will only affect the ones with images. I'll use a selector of grid column end, and I'm going to use span 2. This will ensure that these elements are going to span 2 of the grid spaces. If we save now, you'll see that all of my cards that contain images now take up 2 of the spaces. In addition to this, I'm going to add a display of flex, and when we save and refresh, you will now see that the layout is going to change and the images are going to take up the first area, and because of how I set up my HTML, all of my cards that contain images also contain the div with the class of card content. So the image takes up the first area of the flex grid and the card content takes up the second area. In this way, all of my cards with images will automatically take on a separate layout. I didn't have to add any special classes to these particular elements at all or select these in any special way other than just saying, hey, get the cards that have images and do this. This is a great way that you can augment your layouts in a very easy and non-intrusive manner. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of an effect so that when we hover over any given card, all of the other cards are going to dim out. Now, normally, this would be a little difficult to do because what I want to have happen here is if the user is not hovering on any of the cards, I want my page to look like this. When they hover over a card, I'm going to call attention to the hovered on card by having it appear as we see it right here, but all the other cards are going to dim out a little bit. In order to do this, I'm going to use my has selector once again. This time I'm going to use main :has, and then in parentheses I'll use .card :hover. Then I'm going to go ahead and put .card :not, and then we're going to go ahead and add in the parentheses hover. This selector is a little bit more involved, but basically what we're saying is find main, and if it has any elements with a class of card and they're being hovered, then we want to find any cards that are not being hovered. And then what we're going to do here is we're just going to turn the opacity to 0.5. In addition to doing this, I'm going to add a general rule for .card::hover, and all we're going to do here is we're going to tell the cursor to be the pointer so that the user has a little bit more information that they're on something that could potentially be clickable. If we save now and we refresh our page, once again, the page does not look different until we hover over any of the cards. When we hover over any of the cards, you can see that the rest of the cards are going to dim out. All this does is call attention to the card that the user is on. And of course, if the user scrolls away, none of the cards are going to appear dim. This is kind of a cool effect, and it does show you how you can pair the has selector with other pseudo class selectors so that you can really create some sophisticated behavior that previously was not available without using JavaScript. As we saw earlier, this particular has selector is going to work in pretty much all of the modern browsers except for Firefox. Here's what the page looks like in Firefox, and as you can see, all of those things that we just finished styling are not appearing. Firefox, as I mentioned, does not support the has selector. There are some things that you can do in order to get support in Firefox with these types of effects. The first method is going to just require that we add some CSS, and this isn't going to give us full functionality, but it will look better than what we have. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a vendor prefix for Firefox only, and that is going to be @-moz-document. Then we're going to use URL-prefix, open close parentheses, and then we open the curly braces. Whatever we place within the curly braces becomes rules that are going to only show up if this condition is met. This is a vendor-specific rule, which means that it's only recognized by Mozilla Firefox and other Gecko-based browsers. The URL prefix function is used as a parameter to the @moz document and specifies the prefix of the URL that the rule should apply to. Because we're not passing anything in here, it's just going to apply to any of the pages that are using this CSS document. I'm not going to resolve everything, but I will show you a way that we can get the layout to be more reminiscent of what we had. I'm going to target article.card::image, and then we're just going to go ahead and add a max width of 100%. In addition, I'm going to make another rule that's going to be h1 plus h2. This is an adjacent sibling selector, and it's going to target the following adjacent sibling of a specific element. So in this case, we're going to target our h2 elements. And just to make this easier to see, I'm going to set the background color to red, and then we'll use a margin top of -1 rem. If we save this and I refresh in Firefox, you're going to see that the layout is going to change a little bit, and now we have something that is closer to what we had before. Now, I only changed these few rules just to show you how this works. If I wanted to fully change the layout like we had in our other browsers, then I would need to add some more CSS into our rules. So this is one way that you can go about resolving this issue. You may not be able to select everything and format it in the exact same way, but you should be able to get pretty close, and obviously you'll be able to make your page look closer to what you had before. What I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out this rule, and now I'm going to show you another method that is going to make this page look exactly like it does in the other browsers. This second method of getting support in all of the browsers is going to require that we add a little bit of JavaScript. So I'm going to make a script tag at the bottom of my HTML document. What I want to do here is I want to select all of the elements that contain a child image, and then I want to apply a specific CSS style to the parent elements using JavaScript. Prior to the has selector, there is no way with CSS to be able to select a parent element by selecting a child element. But by using JavaScript, we can easily do this. Now, because I only want my JavaScript to apply if the user is using Firefox, I'm going to start off with a condition. This code is going to check to see if the user's browser is Mozilla Firefox. What's happening is the navigator.userAgent is going to return a string that contains information about the user's browser, such as its name, version, and platform. Index of Firefox searches the navigator user agent string for the substring of Firefox. If the substring is found, index of returns the starting index of the substring in the string. Otherwise, it's going to return -1. Bang ==-1 checks whether the result of index of Firefox is not equal to -1. If the result is not equal to -1, it means the substring Firefox was found in the navigator user agent string, which means that the user's browser is Firefox. So essentially, the code is checking whether the user's browser is Firefox by looking for the substring of Firefox in the navigator user agent string. Because we're wrapping this inside of a condition, this block of code that we're going to place inside of the curly braces are only going to run if this condition is met. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable. I'll call this parent L, and we're going to make this equal to document.querySelectorAll, and then we're looking for an element with the class name of card. Next, I'm going to create a loop that's going to loop through the parent elements and apply styles to those that contain a child image. Here, I'll go ahead and use a for loop. What we're doing here is we're initializing a variable called I, and we're setting the value to 0. This is going to keep track of our loop's progress. I less than parent element length sets the condition for the loop to continue running. The loop is going to continue to run as long as the value of I is less than the length property of the parent element object. The length property is a number that represents the number of elements in an array. And because we're using querySelectorAll, that's going to give us an array. Finally, I++ is going to increment the value of I by 1 after each iteration of the loop. This ensures that the loop will eventually stop running when I becomes greater than or equal to the length of parent element. Inside the curly braces for our for loop, we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to call this one the parent. We're going to make this equal to the variable that we initially made, and then we're going to pass in the square braces I. So this is getting the index number of the parent element. Then I'm going to make one more condition, and this is going to be if the parent.querySelector, and then we're going to pass in image, and then we'll open our curly braces. If the parent has an image, we're going to do whatever we write right here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put the parent, and again, I'm not going to style everything. I'll just add a little bit of code to change the formatting. If the parent element, which essentially is our card element, has an image, we're going to add a style of grid column end, span 2, and another style of display flex. If we save our page and we come back to Firefox and we refresh, you can see that the layout has now updated, and now our page is more reminiscent of what we had previously. If you wanted to add the additional functionality that we had included in our CSS, we would just have to continue to add more of these style JavaScript lines in the JavaScript file. And because this is wrapped inside of the condition that is testing for Firefox, this will not have effect on any of the browsers that are not Firefox and that support the native CSS functionality that we had previously created. So now you know how to use the has selector It's really awesome, and I'm looking forward to when we have full support across the board on all the modern browsers. But until that point occurs, you now know how you can resolve the issue using either CSS or JavaScript.